Hello and welcome to Connecting Society, a podcast about how everyday data can shape our lives. I'm Shada Kashef, Senior Public Engagement Manager for Administrative Data Research UK, or ADR UK to me and you.
And I'm Mark Green, Professor of Health Geography at the University of Liverpool.
In this podcast, we're exploring all the different ways in which the information that's collected about our everyday lives, from our interactions with health services, our voting behaviours, police and crime reporting, educational achievements, and more, is used by researchers and policymakers to make better decisions to support society and make the world a better place.
So, Shada, do you think they use admin data in other countries?
Probably yes.
Correct, yes. So I think that's a good place to start learning, and we're going to learn about a new country today. So got a top fact about the country, see if you can guess the country as well.
Okay.
Did you know that Edam cheese is made there and is indeed made backwards?
It's made backwards?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Think about it.
So it starts... Oh, I don't know. But I'll guess the
Think about the
country.
spelling.
Think about... Oh! Good one. Yeah, I'll guess the country. I'm going to say the Netherlands.
Well done. Very good,
Yay.
very good. So we're talking today to learn a bit more about how we in the UK can learn more from the Netherlands in terms of how they use their administrative data. So let's take a listen to our interview. Across Europe, governments are experimenting with new ways of using our everyday data to understand society and help improve people's lives. And there's a lot for us to learn in the UK about what works elsewhere if we're going to make better use of administrative data. So in today's episode, we're going to go Dutch. The Netherlands has a wonderful national infrastructure called ODISSEI, which, for those of you who aren't fans of acronyms, is the Open Data Infrastructure for Social Science and Economic Innovations, which is quite the mouthful, so we'll just stick with ODISSEI for today. ODISSEI has become a testbed for what can happen when information from different parts of our lives, like work, family, health, and neighbourhoods, are brought together to safely answer some of those big societal questions that we have. At the same time, the Netherlands has a painful history of how detailed records were misused during the Holocaust, when registration systems were turned into tools of persecution. This shapes how people in the Netherlands think about data today. So the question that we're answering today is, how can we build advanced systems that use our data to improve lives, whilst also minimizing the potential for public harm? To help us answer that through telling us about the Dutch experience, we have today with us Dr. Tom Emery, who is the Executive Director of ODISSEI. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you. So Tom, can you tell the listeners a bit about who you are?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a social scientist by training. I actually did my PhD in Edinburgh. You might be able to tell from my voice already that I'm not Dutch. I come from the UK originally. My background in research is in social policy. And now I do research into childcare and family dynamics and things like that. But over the years, as I've been doing research, I became increasingly interested in and engaged in the actual data that underlies that, and the infrastructure and tools and methods that really enable different types of research questions to be answered. And so, that's where a lot of my interest now lies, in infrastructure and making data available for research.
Oh, fantastic. And I think we'll touch a bit about, you've been on both sides of being in the UK and being in the Netherlands. So I think we'll have a good little comparison of how we're doing and what we can do better a little bit later. So can you tell us a bit about ODISSEI? What is it? What does it do? What types of data do they have? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so ODISSEI's been around for about 10 years now. And I think one of the first really crucial things to understand is ODISSEI itself doesn't have data. It's a federated infrastructure. So what we really do, and what we did at the outset as well, there were lots of really great bits of data infrastructure in the Netherlands, surveys, administrative data, panel projects, all these different kinds of things. And what Odyssey did was create a framework for them to collaborate and develop a kind of interoperability framework. So that as a researcher, it was a kind of seamless, integrated ecosystem rather than lots of different pieces pulling in different directions. Um, and so it's a really kind of coordinated effort. And in the kind of Dutch tradition, we would call this poldering. So as you may know, the Netherlands is a country that is generally below sea level. So as a
Yeah.
country, it is very reliant on cooperation in order to kind of make sure everyone keeps their head above water. And this is basically what happened with the social science infrastructures. So after the financial crisis in 2008, there was a lot of budget cuts. So we needed to band together and collaborate in order to kind of keep our head above water. So that's effectively what happened. And now what we have is a really coordinated ecosystem. And through Odyssey, we work together to establish common policies, common access procedures, and a common infrastructure, and a common strategic agenda to ensure that we're best serving social researchers across the Netherlands.
Well, that's great. I'm going to jump in there. There's a couple of
Yeah.
technical terms, and just for our listeners who might not be familiar with them. So we had federated and interoperability,
Yeah,
which I
sure.
think to me and you, or how I'd explain to my dad, is a bit like you said, it's people working together. So it's bringing together, I guess, things in different places, making sure they can talk together. So this with data systems,
Yeah.
and making them very easy to understand. And so they could all be used in one place. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think, especially when it comes to data, that's really important to note. So we have a lot of different data providers in there, and the data gets collected in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's done through a survey where you're getting consent from people to collect their data. It's really explicit about what they're doing as part of a survey. They know they're participating in a scientific project. Whereas administrative data is very, very different. So there's no real consent procedure. It's data that's been collected for other purposes that will be useful for research. And so you can't just throw that data together into a big pool. It really has to be federated and distributed in order to really manage the access controls and ensure that the people, the data controllers, the people responsible for that data, retain full control of it at all times, basically.
I mean, that's much better than I could have explained it, I think. I mean, there's a lot of data, and that
Yeah.
sounds very complicated, bringing all these things together. So can you give us an example, really, of like a great use case of the Odyssey system and how it's been used, I guess, to maybe make better decisions?
Yeah, so I think in modern social science, I think there's three really large, interesting areas of social data that are very commonly used by the scientific community that we kind of look at. One of those is administrative data. So that would be things that sit in what we call the government registers. So in the UK, that'll be like tax registers, people's educational records, criminal records, all these different kinds of things. So it's the basic digital crumbs of the operations of the state. And researchers can, under certain conditions, very controlled conditions, get access to that data to answer research questions. So that's one pool. Then the other pool is survey data. And in Odyssey, what we have is an online panel where researchers can actually field their questions or conduct experiment with around 10,000 people who are contacted
Oh.
every month, and they fill out this survey, and they do all different kinds of experiments in there, and we can monitor them over time to see how their lives change and develop and evolve. And then the third part is what we would call like digital trace data, which we increasingly get through something called data donation. And this is more about as you go through life, you create digital footprint across all different kinds of services. And that data is really useful for understanding all different kinds of other behavior. And what's really important about Odyssey, though, is we develop a framework where those three things can be combined together as well. So you can take the digital trace data and link it to that survey that I was mentioning before, but also then onwardly link that to the administrative data. So you can get the best of both worlds of all the different types of data all in one environment, which really opens up a whole new range of different types of research questions.
Yeah, and I mean the digital trace is quite exciting because I mean I've seen in the UK things like linking loyalty card data into hospital admissions or diagnoses. So linking like prescriptions that people buy over the counter and using that as predicting of like early cancer diagnosis, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through like a specific use case for like in the Netherlands, which is kind of either linked together something to administrative data within that kind of system.
Yeah, the key bit to remember is that all these different types of data have their strengths and weaknesses. There's no one type of data that is perfect, and it's what we're trying to do is leverage all the different good bits from each to
Yeah.
try and minimize the weaknesses. So when you're talking about the digital trace data, for example, digital trace data, it can be very granular, it can get a lot of detail, and it can actually be very high in volume as well. Its problems are it has all kinds of selectivity issues about it. So it really depends on you using a particular service in a particular way for you to show up. So, for example, we've been looking at linking the Dutch equivalent of the Tesco club card
Yeah.
to the data. But not everyone shops at Tesco's, and not everyone that shops at Tesco's uses a club card. And some people probably have 3 or 4 club cards for various reasons because they keep forgetting them and stuff. So it's really tricky, even if you get that data, to understand what it means. But when you start linking to survey data or even administrative data, you get a better sense of how that sits within this wider framework. And you can actually then understand the extent to which it could be generalized or the extent to which you're actually covering the whole population. So this is where you can get some very nice complementarities between them. Yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of last one on it. I mean, how is it used is it used for government decision making or policy making? Is there kind of how does it feed into there?
Well, one of the things, as I said, we have 45 member organizations from across the Netherlands. So they include lots of economics faculties and social science faculties from across the Netherlands. But it also includes what we call public research agencies. They're called planbureaus in Dutch, and they're actually situated within the ministries in
Yeah.
government. So it's basically they conduct research, policy research for government. And what they're quite often interested in is methodological advances, different ways of looking at questions, and these kind of things. So a lot of the innovations and things that we're working on then feed forward into policy from that perspective. And this can be on new innovations in how the data is organized and processed, right through to analytical methods that are being applied.
Excellent. So, kind of moving on from there, one of the things I alluded to in my introduction was that the Netherlands has a difficult history, I guess, in how data has been used in the past, and
Right.
I feel like it's a difficult topic, but it's important learning
Mm.
because it sets up how I guess the Netherlands now approaches data. So, can you tell us a bit about, I guess, how administrative data and how population registers themselves were used, in particularly during the Nazi occupation period? Because I think it's really important for our listeners to hear a bit about this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first thing to understand as well is the role that data's played in Dutch history more generally. So there's a big difference. It's quite interesting to compare English history and Dutch history in this context as well. So there have been numerous points in English history, for example, where in terms of if you think about the poll tax and the peasants' revolt and all these different kinds of things where administrative data collectors and holders have actually been attacked, right? And
Yeah.
this is actually a lot less common in the Netherlands because as a state, we talked already about where the Netherlands comes from. It's really about draining the country and making sure that it doesn't sink into the sea. To do that, it requires quite a large amount of collaboration. And that requires good tax records and a good account of who is living where, basically.
Yeah.
So there is an inherent civic attitude towards population registers that is very positive. And it was actually the French that brought the population registers in the Napoleonic period to the Netherlands. And since then, they've been a kind of key part of civic life, right? So
Yeah.
being in the registers is an important part of that. When it came to the Second World War period, what was actually included within those registers was your religious denomination. And so those registers were used during the occupation to then target the Jewish population, who were then obviously subjected to the Holocaust. Within 15 years, though, after the end of the Second World War, the entire system of civic register was reestablished and very much brought back. And I think it's an interesting question when you compare it to the UK, for example, where civic registers have been a lot more fragmented and a lot
Yeah.
less universalistic in nature, let's say. Why is it the country that has seen the worst case of abuse, you would say, not the country that is more skeptical? And The reason behind that is it's really part of their civic identity, and it's crucial to the actual functioning of the state. And so the Netherlands really is dependent on this population system being in place. Whereas in the UK, it's the land of George Orwell, and there's a lot of skepticism
Right.
towards the state in this regard. And you can even see this in very recent debates around ID cards and things like that. There's a huge amount of skepticism about pulling that kind of data together. So it's just very different cultures around data, how that's used in government decision making, and the degree of trust that surrounds that, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's so different to the UK's experience. And I don't think it's that people in the UK don't like the data and the data systems. Hopefully they see the value in that. But I think it's just so amazing how it's a completely different beast in that Dutch experience in Dutch life. Um,
Well, I
so
think
go on.
part of the crucial point to remember is whenever data's been pulled together in the Netherlands, the whole point is it's been for civic betterment, building things, civic resources. Traditionally in the UK, when you're collecting taxes and want to know where everyone lives, is to fight a war. So whether it was fighting the French in the 13th century or whatever, through to today. So again, as I mentioned, the ID cards recently, the first thing that people wanted to do with ID cards was to improve security of the country. Whereas actually, I think what people want to see do is, well, if you could tell me that it's going to make the schools better, or it's going to make the health system better,
Yeah.
or it's going to make transport better, then they would be a bit more forgiving about how the data is going to be collected and integrated and used. But it doesn't tend to be the focus in the UK.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's making that positive case, isn't it? Of
Yeah.
like, what can we achieve with all of this beyond administrative functions sometimes of all of this information. I mean, the population registers in the Netherlands are really interesting because I'm just thinking that, in the UK, we've had a lot of talk about should we continue with our census or could we by any chance kind of replace it through administrative data? And the Netherlands is that conversation's moved on a long time ago. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the last census in the Netherlands was, I believe, in 1971, and that was really just to double check that that they've got everything correct with their administrative data systems. So when it comes to actually, they don't really conduct a census; it's a freeze on the administrative data systems, and at that point, you can kind of tell how many people are living in the country on a given date, and that is actually what forms the basis of the population records. The administrative records here are dynamic, and we kind of count and register people as they go,
Yeah.
which is very different to the UK. I think, though, just to kind of take a point of clarity on this, I think it's really interesting to look across countries across the world, and the ones that are able to actually run this kind of system relative to the ones that have had trouble with it. And I call the Netherlands the Goldilocks country. And I think it's one of the largest countries that has a system like this, because once you get beyond a certain size, it gets very, very complicated. And it's no surprise that when you get to the UK or the US or even Germany, these are heavily federated systems. And to be able to have a kind of a real integrated administrative data system that's capable of doing this is really, really difficult.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mean, it's great that you have that, and I'm assuming that it's still relatively popular in the Netherlands. People really like it, or do they? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is, as long as it functions well, and I think actually the thing is that people don't think about it so much, and they like not to have to think about it. I think there's a broad agreement that the government should have a good understanding of what resources are needed where, and I think conversely, whenever I've described not just in the Netherlands but elsewhere, the census process that they go through not only in the UK but also in the US, for example. I mean, it sounds like insanity. It's quite often, or even the thing that always got me coming to the Netherlands. Population registers are actually really functional as well. So, in the Netherlands, if you want to open a bank account, what you actually can take your registration from the municipality to the bank, and that's your proof of registration and identity. Whereas in the UK, you quite often have to take your recent gas bill, which is the weirdest to validate your identity ever. So these kinds of things make life a lot simpler, and I think that part is really appreciated by the population.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to, like you said earlier, it's like there's a very positive benefit to an individual through
Yeah.
having these systems in place, and they can see that firsthand rather than, I mean, that's terrible. Like if I have to go get some sort of letter of proof of address, I mean, everything's done online now. It's always harder for me to find these things.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, you kind of mentioned it a bit earlier. You talked about, you studied in University of Edinburgh.
Mhm.
I know that was quite a long time ago now there, but I guess you have some understanding of that UK system in
Mm.
terms of the data that's available and how we collect data. And I guess you've learned a lot from being in the Netherlands for a long time as well. So, what do you think we in the UK could learn from the Netherlands, the experience in the Netherlands, and what do you think we could do better?
So I think, as I said, there are definitely lessons to be learned between the two, but it's also worth acknowledging the differences. So, as you say, I did my PhD at Edinburgh, and one of the challenges facing the UK is you have four nations, which is something that the Netherlands just doesn't have to deal with.
Yeah.
And that kind of complex and almost asymmetrical system. So not all the countries are the same size, and so their administrative capacity slightly deviates and is slightly different. And that, for example, for England, everything is can be quite integrated, but because it doesn't have these devolved authorities in the same way that Scotland and Wales does. In terms of the lessons that could be learned from the Netherlands, though, I think the Netherlands is very good because of its size that makes it somewhat more achievable, is trying to reduce duplication and actually coming together and understanding that there's a shared interest and a shared aim. So you mentioned at the outset as well about the love of acronyms amongst scientists. So scientists love nothing better than to create a new organization and give it a new acronym. And one of the things we've been trying to do, even though Odyssey is an acronym, is to reduce this kind of fragmentation of new initiatives and new developments to try and make it coherent. And I think that's really important. There's been so much progress in the UK in the last 10 years through things like ADR UK, but also a few other initiatives have really tried to consolidate the landscape and make it coherent and integrated in a singular direction. And quite often that means, everyone having to put down their pet hobby a little bit and say, yeah, this is actually, we've got a longer term, greater ambition, which is really facilitating the development of this national infrastructure.
Yeah, and I mean, as a researcher who's been based in England
Mm.
all of his career, I spent most of my career getting jealous of my colleagues in Scotland who seem to always have much better data than what we have, and it always very much frustrates me that we don't have this kind of national single purpose data sets available to us, and that there's still a long way to go in that some of the devolved nations have better or kind of poorer access to a lot of data sets. I think if I told my dad that, he just wouldn't understand why the
Why was that?
data wasn't the same.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, absolutely. And I can imagine it's very frustrating as a researcher when you're approaching the UK to try and find one point of entry. And the thing that we try to bear in mind in Odyssey, and I think that's been a really important lesson, is to entirely think about it from the researcher's perspective and making it easier. It should be a single point of entry. It should be as
yeah.
simple and as easy as possible for researchers to step in securely, safely, and ethically, but as simple as possible to actually access the data and get on doing the science.
Yeah. So if we look a bit to the future, so if we think about 10, 20 years ahead, I guess, in the future, what kind of relationship do you think places like the UK or the Netherlands would you like to see between people, their data, and I guess the government and how these things are all being used?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very historically we're at a very important moment. I think in terms of people's relationship to data.
Yeah.
So what's quite interesting, the administrative data systems that we've been talking about, they stem from, and it's no surprise that the Dutch administrative data system came about in 1812. This was the nation building phase, and part of that nation building was building administrative data capacity, and it was very similar in the UK, right? So um, and this is actually kind of forms the basis of how we conduct research now. And now what we're seeing is just a massive change in how people go about their daily lives and the pervasive nature of data. So what I think some of the crucial conversations over the next few years are going to be is when your data flies across those borders, it operates outside of that system. So data sovereignty is a massive issue at the moment. When you're using a particular service, be that Google, be that, if you're on X or something like that, or if you're, shopping through Amazon, that data is flying about in all different kinds of places. And it's very useful for research purposes and scientific purposes. It's also useful for you as a citizen to understand your rights, your obligations, and things like that. And I think getting a grip on that is going to be what's crucial in the coming years. Science is part of that, but it's not all of that. And I think it's really important. So I'm currently sat in Brussels, because Brussels is taking a very big attempt to wrestle with some of these questions around data sovereignty, to try and empower kind of data consumers. And I think that is what is really essential at the moment. As a side effect, what that's going to help for scientists is really, we can also utilize that data to understand people's lives and hopefully help a broad range of people. But it's this conversation about how we relate to these large online platforms, our digital trace data, and how we can retake control of that's going to be crucial in the coming years.
Yeah, and I think it's just there's so much data out there, often, like you say, just so many possibilities, but it's all fragmented in very different parts, of whether, like you say, whether you shop at Tesco's or you don't shop at Tesco's,
Mm.
like a way of capturing some people, but not everyone. And you always end up like potentially just having a very small, narrow viewpoint of some people's lives that isn't broadly representative. And yet people make decisions on these kind of data that aren't necessarily representative, generalizable within themselves. They could have value, but I mean, it's hard to know, I guess, sometimes. And, it's almost like the kind of horse has already bolted with all of this, and that all of these data just became available and we were left scrambling really to know about what value they might have. And of course, there's a very real, like, people don't want their data being misused. This is all very much new to us as citizens themselves, ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about kind of centering those individuals in how we kind of access and analyze that data, making sure that they're aware of what's being done,
Yeah.
making sure that it's actually serving a public good. Um, yeah. And I would like to see scientific infrastructures put that at their heart, to be honest.
Okay, well, we're nearly at our time, but I've got one final question for you. So, should the UK keep the census?
Uh, from my perspective, I think it's a really okay. So knowing the UK data community, this is a very hot topic and a very contentious one. And so I would say I would really sit on the fence very hard and say it depends, because it's very easy for me to sit here and say, well, in an ideal world, you wouldn't, because a non-census world has a lot of benefits. You can have live updating data, and it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot better. But that's easier said than done. And what's really crucial, and what it should be at the fundamental heart of that decision-making process, is data quality. So as we go forward, making sure that we have a real understanding of what happens and when. And I think we need to, my answer, I guess, would be there should be a real concrete transition process in place with quality assurance checks all over the place. And I think one thing that actually reminds me of at the moment is you see a lot of European surveys, for example, shifting from face-to-face data collection to online. And it's a similar kind of problem. You're shifting mode and you're shifting how you're collecting data. And there needs to be some overlap here so that you can calibrate exactly how it's being done, make sure you're capturing all the communities that you would otherwise miss, and really understanding what that means. So that would be my cop-out answer, I think.
I thought that was a good answer. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. Maybe this is the sort of thing for a future episode on here for us to explore a lot more. Okay, well, that is everything we've got time for today. So just to say, Tom, thank you very much for your time. Well, we're going to head back to the main studio right now.
Thanks. Pleasure to join you.
And we're back in the studio now. So, Shada, you've had a chance to listen back to that. So what did you think?
Another great conversation. I thought Tom had some excellent sound bites. I really loved how he referred to administrative data as the digital crumbs of the state. And there was so many strong points in that discussion. You asked some really good questions. Like, it was really fascinating learning about the history before and after World War II, and sort of how our cultural identity is so deeply connected with how we feel about data use. But if I had to pick one thing that really stuck with me, it was the emphasis on the importance of people being able to see the benefits of how their data is used. especially in the Dutch context. It reminds me of a piece of work I did in 2022. I was lucky enough to travel to a few cities across the UK with a colleague from the Office for Statistics Regulation. And what we were doing was we were speaking to members of the public about what public good use of data actually means to them. And one of the things that was loud and clear from those discussions was, perhaps unsurprisingly, people want to know how data use can improve their lives and how it can improve society and how it can improve their neighbourhood and so on. Like, they weren't interested in abstract research or research findings. They wanted to know about real, tangible impact. And I think that's what's so impressive about the Dutch approach. They can clearly answer that question. And this is such a powerful example of when you can show the benefits, it truly transforms the conversation around trust and data use.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think we do a lot of really good stuff in the UK, and we don't communicate like how we're using data for the public good to make better decisions, to improve lives. I think we just don't sing and celebrate that as much. So, and, you know, that's the sort of thing we can learn a bit more from.
Definitely. And I don't know, I hope that with this podcast we're doing a little bit to
Bit by
introduce
bit.
the benefits. Yep, definitely. Hopefully we've got some new listeners with this new season. But yeah, fantastic job, Mark.
Thank you very much.
And with that, thank you so much to our listeners and watchers.
Until next time, stay curious about how your everyday data might shape society.